Hey, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Talking Hockey Sense. My name is Chris Peters. This is episode 75 of the podcast. So glad you could join us for it because it is Men's Frozen 4 week. We are here. The final weekend of the men's college hockey season is upon us. And since we're recording this the day before the actual Frozen Four, we're not going to spend a ton of time on it, but actually look at the college season as a whole and a lot of the news and different happenings that have been happening through this last portion of the season here as we get set to crown a champion. So didn't want it to go stale early, so we wanted to make sure that there's a lot of evergreen kind of conversation about this college season, which has been truly remarkable in so many different ways. And we do have a great guest today, which I will bring in just a few minutes. Brad Schlossman is here, so we will talk to him very shortly. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about where to find this podcast. If you are listening to it on your app of choice, that is excellent. You can always do that. You can also check us out on YouTube and on FloHockey or the Flow Sports app. You can find us there. Plenty of different ways to interact with the podcast. You can always ask questions as well. We'll have a Q&A at the end of this episode after we talk Frozen Four, after we talk college free agency and all of the different topics at hand. But really excited to move into this stage of the season, the close of the season. And to do that, to help me talk about this, I cannot be more pleased to bring back the world champion of Talking Hockey Sense, Brad Schlossman. He is with us today on the podcast and just a tremendous resource for both myself and for you, the fans, because Brad knows what's going on. So, Brad, for the umpteenth time, that's exaggerating because we've only had 75 episodes, but for many time recurring guests, welcome back to Talking Hockey Sense, buddy.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, so Brad, we are not at the Frozen Four, you or I, but we are following it because that is what we do. This is what we do. I was planning to be in Tampa, but I have some other responsibilities that unfortunately came up, so I won't be there. But we obviously will both be following it very closely, and we're both sad because it's in Tampa and it looks beautiful and everybody seems to be having a great time, and they're doing it all without us. But I think it'd be more fun if we were there, quite frankly, but that's just you and me. So, Brad, before, like I said, we're recording this the day before the tournament begins. We'll know our national champion in a few days, but I did want to preview the event a little bit because quite frankly, this is a really exciting Frozen Four. There is a lot of star power. There is some historic matchups in terms of, old rivalries renewed. There is the element of, some of the highest end NHL prospects that are in college hockey today are in this tournament. And still at this point, there are actually 41 total NHL draft picks among the three rosters, and Quinnipiac has 3 of those players. So, it's pretty amazing to see kind of the way this season shook out and the last 4 teams standing. So as we head in, we've got Boston University versus Minnesota to kick us off, and that's the matchup that I want to talk about first. And quite frankly, you've got a juggernaut in Minnesota that has both the mix of experience and skill. You've got a younger team in Boston University that, has a lot of talent still, but doesn't have nearly the depth that Minnesota does. They do have a really good goaltender. They have a first-year head coach in Jay Pandolfo that's gotten things going. I mean, this thing could go a lot of different ways. What is your take on this as you saw this matchup set up?
Yeah, I've seen more Minnesota than Boston University this year. And going from that angle of things, uh, if Minnesota plays its best, I really like Minnesota.
Yeah.
But Minnesota will go through big ebbs and flows. And if they don't play well, Boston University will win. I think a lot of this will be dictated on how Minnesota plays because when they're on, they're really good. And when they're not, they become a little bit average. So it depends which Minnesota team shows up. If the best version of them shows up, which did at certain points in the regional, and they were really good when it did, I think they get by. I think, like you said, some of these young teams with a lot of star power have been too young and have struggled. I think the fact that Minnesota's back end is old, veterans, I think that gives them the edge in this one.
Yeah, I think that to me is what stands out the most. I think Boston University also banged up a little bit too. There are a couple of guys. Wilmer Skoog's a game time decision. Case McCarthy's out for the year. Nick Zabanet might play. So there's certainly that hurts your depth. I mean, Skoog is the kind of guy you need against Minnesota, who
Hmm.
brings a little bit of that size and skill factor.
Yep.
But that's one. It's going to be a tough matchup. What I think the X factor in this game is Drew Comesso. Because Drew Comesso has won his last 9 starts for Boston University. He's got a 936 save percentage. He was very inconsistent throughout the year. Chicago Blackhawks draft pick, a guy that was on the Olympic team last year. And it's been a really up and down year, but he has played his best hockey late in the season. And if he gets hot, he could potentially steal them the game. But you look at Minnesota, and I think you mentioned the back end. Let's think we're talking Brock Faber, maybe one of the best overall defensemen in terms of pure defending in the entire country. You've got Ryan Johnson, another excellent defender. Jackson Lacombe, who's been one of the most productive blue liners over the last 3 years, and then you've also got guys like Mike Kester and others that can fill in some of those gaps that and continue to produce. But they also have 2 Hobey Baker finalists up front. They've got Logan Cooley, Matt Nyes. We can debate the merits of how the Hobey finalists were all. We've talked about that last week. But one of those 2 guys very well could come out of the weekend as the Hobey Baker winner. And obviously Jimmy Snuggerud also on that line. To me, Brad, we've seen a lot of really good lines. You covered a great one in the CBS line with Nick Schmaltz, Brock Besser, and Drake Kajula that helped win a national championship for North Dakota. We've seen the CCM line of yesteryear for Michigan with Kyle Connor, Tyler Mott, and JT Comfer. There have been some really great lines, but this line of Nyes, Cooley, and Snuggerud to me is one of the most perfectly constructed lines you can have. You have size, you have skill, you have physicality, you have speed. They have everything you need to produce offense. It seems like they have. How do you slow a line like that down if you're Boston University?
Well, you got to find ways to play in the offensive zone against them. You can't let them have too much zone time. I thought there were stretches over the regional where their opponents did play really well against that big line. One of the big differences in the regionals was that it wasn't just the big line for Minnesota. When those guys weren't going, they have other lines that can score too. And that's really what got Minnesota going, I thought. When things weren't going well against Canisius at the start, I thought it was the other lines that played really well and potted some really key goals. So obviously that line can single-handedly win games. I think one of the differences in Minnesota is if you shut down that line, which is hard to do, you're not guaranteed to win because they have other lines that can produce.
Absolutely. You got Bryce Brodzinski to worry about, Rhett Pitlick, Aaron Huglin. I mean, there are all these different skilled players that can beat you a variety of ways. Jackson Nelson had a big productive year, a guy that's probably going to get an NHL contract when his season's over. So, this is a team that is really well built, really well constructed. And then you also have Justin Close, who has played very well throughout this entire season and has almost, kind of forgotten the fact that this is a guy that had to take over mid-year last year out of nowhere. And then he won, got him to the Frozen Four, and now they're back. But again, we've seen these little instances for Minnesota throughout the season, and it happened in the Big Ten championship game. You get one little lull, and all of a sudden, the game flips on them. And certainly Boston University has the skill to potentially do that. One guy I did want to talk about before we move on from this particular matchup, in addition to the others, is Lane Hudson. I have a story up on him and on FloHockey.tv, which you can read about, basically putting his season into context. Most productive season by a freshman defenseman, age 19 or younger, since in 40 years. You look at all the Hobey Baker. He's not a Hobey hat trick finalist. Like if I were voting, he would have been in my 3. And I think that what he's done at his age is something special. But then you also look at how he's been used by BU, and we've talked about his size. He's listed at 5'10", 163 right now, and it might be a little generous. And but in his draft year, he was essentially 5'7", 140. And he played 39 minutes against Providence in the hockey semifinal, turned around the next day, played 33 minutes, and then played big minutes in both games that they won. I mean, this is a guy that you don't like. We expect Brock Faber to do that for, a guy that's like 6'1", can skate, has some size, and Lane Hudson is just this dynamic presence. I've personally never seen anybody like him. I think that there have been a lot of Quinn Hughes comparisons. There have been, like, people have said Sam Girard, and it's all, size related. I'm just like, he's Johnny Gaudreau as a defenseman. That's what he
Mhm.
looks like to me. He's an underdeveloped player. He still has a lot of time left. He's got strength to build, but can Lane Hudson potentially take over this game? Based on what you've seen, and I know you haven't seen him as much as you've seen Minnesota, but based on what you've seen, I mean, does he have that potential?
Yeah, I mean, I've really liked him since. I mean, you saw him over in Germany last year,
Yeah.
and he was really really good in that tournament for the U18s, and he is a game breaker. There's no doubt about it. He is one of those guys who can take over. Um, so he's one to watch for sure. He can generate from the back end. He's difficult to, you know, him and Hughes. We'll talk about the Michigan game in a little bit, but both those guys are guys that can get defenses out of alignment and out of sorts.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes a matchup nightmare for teams when they're like, okay, well, we're out there against Matt Brown's line. Uh, we've got those three forwards to worry about, but there's also this defenseman that's going to sneak in at any point, and we're not going to have much of a response to him. I mean, some of the space that he finds, the plays that he makes down low. When he was at the National Team Development Program, it just seemed like all Rutger McGroarty had to do was go to the net and put his stick down. Lane Hudson was going to put it off of his stick and into the net, and that's how Rutger, who's a really good goal scorer and plays for Michigan now, would get a lot of his goals. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch Lane Hudson on this stage. I think about some of the great performances that we've seen at the Frozen Four over the years. And he's going to have one of those if BU's going to win. He's going to play so much that he's going to have to make a significant impact on the game. But go read more about all the numbers behind the insanity of his season, because it's there. And I can't wait to watch him in this setting right here. And I still recall the first time I ever saw him was at the Under-18 World Championship 2 years ago in Texas, and he was playing as an underager, and some of the plays he was making then at 16 years old, just insane. So can't wait to see that. But let's move on to the second semifinal, which will feature Quinnipiac, which, again, I know I've practiced pronouncing it so many times, and I don't think that's the correct way, because I've watched the video on YouTube about how to pronounce it so many times. But Brad, you were on this team from the beginning. They only lost 4 games all year. Yaniv Peretz has been insane. He's been great. He hasn't faced a huge number of shots because of the way that they defend, but he's played very well. They have another Hobie top 10 guy in Colin Graff, who nobody could have seen this season that he had coming. They've got tremendous defensemen, very veteran team back there. They've got guys like Skylar Brindamore, who's been a 4-year player and one of the best defensive forwards in college hockey. Shocking. I wonder where he learned that. Maybe the guy that won the Selke that, raised him. But I think they're going to be playing a Michigan team that is so skilled and can come at you in waves, and plays in a game in layers in a way that I don't think Quinnipiac has seen. But at the same time, I look and I'm like, gosh, I don't feel like this is a great matchup for Michigan, because I think of how disciplined Quinnipiac is and how free-flowing Michigan can be. That's exactly the kind of style that Quinnipiac just seizes on, and feasts on, and that's what they did in the regional. They basically
Mm-hmm.
lied in wait and pounced. That's kind of how I mean, I guess that's the Bobcat way, but that's how it is. So, I mean, I want to leave it to you though, because you were on this podcast in the very beginning of the season. You said that team is one of my top teams in the whole country, and sure enough, once again, you were correct. in your analysis.
I think I said they were my top team. Maybe at the time we recorded, I was going back and forth between Minnesota and Quinnipiac. I ended up going Quinnipiac number one. In as much as the high draft picks and the young future NHL stars make the headlines, a lot of times the older teams win in college hockey. This is a team with 7 fifth-year seniors, I believe. That's like a quarter of their roster. They're veteran on D. They, in the ECAC, they really hold shots on goal low to opponents. They protect their goaltender fairly well. What you alluded to, the Ohio State game, we saw a team that kind of dictated puck possession on Quinnipiac, but they still did a pretty good job keeping the chances to the outside. Peretz did a really good job goaltending, and they transition. And that I agree that the Michigan matchup is interesting. Michigan probably wins in shots on goal. They probably have more time with puck possession. But Michigan does give up odd man breaks and chances the other way. And I do think Quinnipiac will wait for their chances. They're not going to be overly aggressive, and they're going to defend well and, wait for Michigan to make mistakes and try to feed off those. And I do think this is a type of a matchup that, can feed into Quinnipiac's game. These teams played last year, and Michigan did win. But I do really like this Bobcats team.
Yeah, I do too. And, I think that, you gave a great description of how they play. Like if you're a fan of international hockey and you've ever watched Finland, just find a way. They never have the more talented roster. And we talked about there are 41 draft picks in this on the rosters of these teams. Only 3 of those are on Quinnipiac: Skylar Brindamore, Sam Lipkin, and their backup goaltender. So it's not even that it just does not compare in terms of pedigree. But that's not what matters at this stage of the season. It's certainly not in this stage of the development of the Quinnipiac program, which is now in their third, Frozen Four in the last several years here, and just continues to defy the odds. And I mean, you think back to what they used to be, and people didn't even know who they were. They couldn't even believe they had a Division I team for a long time. And Rand Pecknold's been there from the very beginning, and now here they are again. But I didn't want to talk about Michigan because that's where we have, a lot of prospects. You talked about Luke Hughes a little bit already, and he's going to have to play, as sure-handed a game as he's played all year. They're going to definitely try to put pressure on him a lot, but also Adam Fantilli, the nation's leading scorer on that group. I think that, Michigan's success or failure could very well come down to Eric Portillo and net. He has been another one where it's like, sometimes he's on and he's unbeatable, and then there are other times where, he can be their Achilles heel. But, as I look at this Michigan team and I watch the way that they had to play the game against Penn State, what a great table setter for this particular matchup. Penn State is a possession juggernaut. They fire a lot of shots at your net. They don't give up the puck real easy. They don't give you a ton. They're going to play physical. They're going to see a lot of similarities in Quinnipiac, although I think Quinnipiac does it better. And so that's going to make things more challenging. But, Michigan just took the interim tag off of Brandon Arado as well, the head coach that took over under, pretty tense circumstances with Mel Pearson getting ousted after last season, leading a team to a Frozen Four. And sure enough, he's out of a job, and for a number of reasons, which we've covered on the podcast before. But, this is a team with a rookie head coach, a very young roster, a goaltender that can be a little hit and miss. And then really, they've also had some injuries. Jacob Truscott is a big one on their back end, and he hasn't played in a while. He hasn't played since January. So, there are certainly some things there for Michigan. But I mean, all in all, you've seen them. This is a team that absolutely can go ahead and win not just this game, but the whole thing.
Yeah, they can score in a hurry. That's the big thing about this team. They mirror Minnesota in a lot of ways. The one way they don't is they're not quite as old, especially on the back end. But I think they mirror Minnesota in the fact that, Fantilli and some of these other guys are going to get a lot of publicity. Yet they have guys like Eric Ciccolini who can pop a goal. Jackson Hallam's a tremendous skater. Like
Yeah.
while those guys deserve the accolades, Minnesota's top line and Adam Fantilli for sure, tremendous players. But if you think that's all they have, that's a mistake because these teams can hurt you with several guys. And I think that's what stands out to me about both Minnesota and Michigan is it, yes, they have those good top lines, but it really isn't just those one line teams.
Right. Yeah. Like, and similar to having Lane Hudson for BU, you've got Luke Hughes who can sneak in at any time. Seamus Casey can do the same thing. Ethan Edwards can do the same thing. And that's three guys all drafted by the New Jersey Devils, coincidentally. Hallam is a great example of a player that he might not score, but his speed is going to challenge your defense. Is going to put you under pressure. He's going to be good on the forecheck. And he still could potentially score. Rutger McGroarty has been probably one of their most consistent and best performers through the entire postseason. He scored 3 points, 2 goals and 3 points in the Big Ten championship game. He's had points in each of his last 7, I believe. So at the most important stage of the season, he's elevated his game. Mackie Samoskevich had the game-winning goal. This is a team that has too many weapons, and sometimes you just say, okay, well, they're going to have to be careful with the puck, but not too careful because that's not their style and certainly not Brandon Dorado's style. He's got the green light for these guys. Adam Fantilli, if he can take over a game, watch out because then you're in trouble if you're Quinnipiac and certainly anybody else that they would potentially meet in the next round. But we spent a little more time on the Frozen Four just because I think these are 4 fascinating teams. But I also wanted to talk about the just kind of the overall college hockey landscape because one of the biggest news of the last week was Mike Hastings leaving Minnesota State to go to the University of Wisconsin. I think the University of Wisconsin is probably one of the 6 or 7 best jobs in the country. You think about the budget they have, the notoriety, the tradition, the recruiting pool that they've been able to pull from. And Mike Hastings goes, this man has never had a losing season as a head coach, built Minnesota State into what, and Brad, do you remember when he got hired? Like people are like, this is a dead end. This might be it. Like if he doesn't get this going, that's it. That's your shot. And then you don't get it. You don't get any more. And he took a program that, was at the time, kind of on the come up just, to some degree, but still had a long way to go. And he turns it into, this national powerhouse for years. 6 consecutive conference championships in the regular season. Never been done before in college hockey. Never. And he did it. So now he's at Wisconsin. That's a huge shakeup. You take a coach away from a program that's been a power. And what has happened? The transfer portal has gone bananas. And now Minnesota State is almost looking like they're going to have to build a program, not quite from scratch, but close enough. And so you have been on the transfer portal a ton, and we saw 4 top players leave Minnesota State. We expect, I assume a couple of them are going to end up at Wisconsin, but I wanted to start there because I did also want to talk about the transfer portal in general, because there's a lot of interesting names in there and there's been a lot of interesting movement. And this is something that we knew we'd have to contend with, but or not contend with, but just track, because college hockey has free agency now. And it's for us on the outside, it's kind of fun. It's not fun for the coaches, that's for sure. It's not fun for a lot of fan bases, but for us that follow it, it certainly is. So let's start with Minnesota State. The transfer portal taketh right now. It can also giveth back a little bit too.
Yeah.
But you've been on this beat for the last couple of years as it's become more of a thing. How can you look at Minnesota State's roster from their last game of the season and see like a handful of players still there between guys that signed pro deals and now guys in the transfer portal?
Yeah, it's quite an incredible turnover right there for Minnesota State. A huge adjustment without Mike Hastings and Todd Knott, who will follow him to Wisconsin. Todd Knott's he was there even before Hastings was there. He helped recruit a lot of guys. He was a really key part. And now all of a sudden, Minnesota State's top 9 scorers are all gone. And 8 of those 9 had eligibility remaining. So, some of them signed pro deals, as you said. Jake Livingston, Akita Hirose, and Andre Pavel all signed NHL deals. But that's a lot of turnover, and it feels like every year you just write down Minnesota State preseason poll. You just fill that slot in before you even
Yeah.
start looking at the teams that they're going to win the CCHA. And now it feels like we're entering a new era. There's a new coaching staff, massive turnover, and there's some other teams that have kind of been nipping at their heels the last few years. They haven't been able to overtake them, but they've been there. So I think CCHA is wide open next year.
I mean, it certainly is. It looks that way. Sticking with among the names in the transfer portal, you got David Cillier, who was their leading goal scorer. You've got Christian Fitzgerald, who to me was one of the massive revelations late in the season for that team. Looked like he could play a top 6 role on any program in the country. Did everything right. Was a big postseason presence for them, and they're gone. Bennett Smolik, probably one of their best remaining defensemen, gone. So, and it's hard. And I think if you're a Minnesota State fan, it's okay to feel that level of panic, because I think that us that are not even, connected to the program see that and we're like, whoa, this job that's now open suddenly got a lot more difficult to fill, a lot more difficult. Whoever takes that job doesn't have a plug and play roster, because not only
Mm-hmm.
that, Minnesota State also had one of their better recruiting classes of the Hastings era on the way in, with Cade Littler and Pionk, and guys that have some cachet in the college hockey world. Will they stick to those commitments, or will they go elsewhere? Those are it's tough. It's tough to see. So, but that's the way it goes. But some other things about the transfer portal: Michigan State is another team that has hit the transfer portal and has gotten better going out of it. They lost a few guys, but they're getting better thanks to the portal. And the big ad there is Isaac Howard, first round draft pick of the Tampa Bay Lightning, going from Minnesota Duluth to reunite with his NTDP coach Adam Nightingale at Michigan State. Huge swing there. But one thing that you and I have talked about off the air was that yes, big programs can absolutely benefit from the transfer portal. They can sometimes pull top players off of smaller teams, and that's not necessarily fair. But this is a two-way street. And if you want to remain competitive, and if you want to, some teams have said we're not going to build through the transfer portal, and that's fine. All the power to them. But many or most teams are using the portal to their advantage, and there are plenty of options for them right now. So, based on what you've seen in the portal, how is that going to continue to shake out? And let's talk a little bit more about that two-way street.
Yeah, for sure. I think the portal is here to stay. People love it, people hate it, whatever. I think if you're a coach, you need to just move. You can complain, but not too much, because it is what it is there, and you either are going to embrace it and find a way to build a team in this new era, whether that's through lots of portal guys, through a medium amount or little, whatever. It is here, and you are going to have to just adjust to this life. And I think the teams that adjust to it and use it, the best are going to help themselves out. A lot of teams did this past year. And, some teams, they get a lot of guys back and they don't have to use it. Minnesota, for example, when all those guys decide they're coming back, now all of a sudden they don't go and grab a D-man out of the portal. Had Johnson, Lacombe, and Faber all left, they would have grabbed the D-man out of the portal. So a lot of it is depending on your needs in a particular year. I think you make a good point that it's not a one-way street. There are players at some big-name programs who are really good players that just are not playing a lot. They go to a quote-unquote smaller school, and all of a sudden they thrive. And, you think of a team like Michigan Tech making the tournament as an at-large this year. Well,
Yeah.
they got Jack Works from Denver. He was a guy who really wasn't playing much for Denver. He goes to Michigan Tech, and he was an outstanding player. That was a great pickup for them, and made a huge impact on their season. So I think when you look at some of these teams, there is a way to use it and use it to your advantage. I was looking at certain statistics. The last team to win a national title without a transfer on the roster was 2016 North Dakota. I don't even know when the next one will be. I mean, it could be a while.
Yeah. It could be a
You know,
long time.
I think every team in this year's has a transfer on the roster. Now, not all of them have key players. I would say 2017 Denver won the title. They had a transfer on the roster, wasn't a key player on that team. Every other team since then had a very, very important player who was a transfer on their roster. So take that for what it's worth. It is important. I think you can, you lose some guys unexpectedly, either to pro signings or the transfer portal, and you're able to add an older player. The last thing I'll say, I think the number of players going into the portal is going to dramatically decrease in 2 years. We are still dealing with the fifth year seniors, the COVID year. There are
Yep.
more players that have college eligibility during this 4-year window than ever at any time because everyone has 5 years instead of 4. So, one thing to note, I looked this up over the weekend. 46% of players that were in the portal were people who only had a COVID year left.
Mm.
Now, that tells you it could drop by almost half. The other thing is some of these fifth year seniors are taking higher spots in the lineup. So you're probably seeing some younger players that aren't getting to play and they're going into the portal. Now all of a sudden you get rid of the fifth year seniors and some younger players move up faster in the lineup. They probably stick it out. So I really think we could see almost a 50% drop of players going to the portal in 2 years when this COVID year's gone.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's here to stay. And the one thing I will say is that I know there are a lot of people that hate the portal, but I think that the the flexibility that this gives players, not everybody that's transferring is running away from competition. Sometimes
Yeah.
there's just better opportunities elsewhere. Sometimes there's also you know uh, you know it could be a bad fit. The school doesn't have your major, like all the you change majors or anything like that, or suddenly
Yeah.
you're interesting. There are a lot of different reasons to transfer. We've seen, certainly I understand the people being upset that somebody says they don't want to be part of your favorite team anymore, but at the same time players deservingly have leverage now, and
Yeah.
and we're seeing that play out in a variety of different ways. You mentioned it before. This is another thing that kind of impacts the transfer portal, is that you have pro signings. And we're talking a little bit about college free agency, because it has been a very active couple of weeks here in college free agency and with the signings. We've talked about most of the top guys are off the board. There are several players in the Frozen Four that would potentially garner NHL interest. I think Jackson Nelson from Minnesota is one. Matt Brown from Boston University, Wilmer Skoog from BU. Like, there are a number of players that are going to get significant interest in terms of get wanting to be signed by the NHL. But one we just saw, Cade McWard was an interesting one from Ohio State, signed with Vancouver last night. He was a sophomore. I didn't have him listed on my top free agent board because I just simply didn't expect him to come out yet, especially with Mason Lohrei signing with Boston. Now McWard was probably going to be Ohio State's number one defenseman. They're without him. Very interesting there. But we also saw a significant number of Western Michigan players go to the college free agent route. Max Sasson, the Jason Poland, Ryan McAllister, the entire assassin line, the top line for Western Michigan, all gone. And also Aiden Fulp, one of their top defensemen. However, what I will say is programs like Western Michigan sending players to the NHL and getting NHL contracts, and they have done it frequently in the last couple of years. Probably a good thing for the program in the long term, but it's got to hurt in the short term right now. But I know that's a program that you're very familiar with. I mean, Pat Ferschweiler continues to churn out pro prospects for yet another year here.
For sure. I think they certainly would like to have some of those guys back. Jason Poland is a senior. You probably figured he was going to
Yep.
go. But, Ryan McAllister and Max Sasson, you just did not pencil in leaving after 1 and 2 years. Western Michigan did a great job adjusting to those losses last year. They went in the transfer portal, got Zach Galambos and Carter Berger. Ended up being
Yep.
having the best season in program history, in NCHC history, I should say.
Yep.
So, and
And
then you
and they
talk
just
about,
picked up a big one. They just picked up a big one too. Sam Colangelo, second round pick of the Anaheim Ducks. So, and so yeah, that again, now we're seeing the transfer portal works in mysterious ways, people. So see, even Western Michigan is making some big moves here.
and I think when you mention, that it can have its benefits, when you see a big power forwards like Max Sasson signing and Austin Rushoff and Ty Glover even last year and some of these guys, I'm guessing Sam Colangelo looks at that and says, okay,
Yeah.
here's where I'm going.
I'll continue to
So
develop. Yeah.
for sure, so that definitely plays a role, I think.
Yeah, absolutely it does. I mean, I would say that one of the most important factors that your program has to have, or the one of the X factors to recruiting the best players, you have to be a program that produces NHL talent on the regular. You have to prove that you can develop NHL players, and the more guys that sign contracts out of your program, the more draft picks that attend your program and continue to develop, the less likely it is that teams are trying to pull players out of there as quickly. The more likely parent and family advisors are pushing players towards your program. And that's where some of the programs are saying, hey, why aren't we getting that elite player? Part of it is that either perception, it might not be fair all the time, but there might be a perception that your program doesn't produce. Now you look at a place like Western Michigan, which was not an NHL factory by any stretch of the imagination. They've had plenty of guys go through that played in the NHL, but but now you're getting all these guys pushing out contracts, and that is very attractive. And I think that was even attractive for Minnesota State. Once you had guys start signing free agent contracts and you're like, oh, Mike Hastings knows what he's doing, I'm going to go there. So it's amazing how much coaching matters on that front, and player development helps with recruiting a ton as well. So very important there. Brad, before I let you go, I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of college hockey, not just tied to the transfer portal, not just tied to college free agency, but next season. I think there are a lot of unknowns at this point about next year. We don't know all of the players that are going to be coming back to their programs. Does Adam Fantilli return for a second year like all of the Michigan guys did last year? Maybe winning or not winning a national championship plays out that way. We've got more high-end talent coming in. BU and Boston College are going to have two of the best recruiting classes in the country, which is just outstanding to see. Especially with BC having kind of a down year, it seems a little bit more fun when BU and BC are both cooking at about the same level. But just in terms of looking ahead, after we've had a very interesting season, I mean, what are maybe some of the things that you're looking at towards next season? Even Mike Hastings at Wisconsin. I mean, there's so many different storylines to track next year. What are some of the ones that you're going to be keeping a close eye on over the summer here?
Yeah, I think you mentioned it. It felt like Harvard and Northeastern had kind of been almost the Boston highlight programs here. BU lurking there, and BC kind of has not had the sustained success that we saw a decade ago or two. But it's how quickly can BC come back? They obviously have a phenomenal recruiting class. They're going to make the tournament next year. I have no doubt about it. Exactly how high are they going to be? Are they going to be a good team? Or are they going to be up in the upper echelons? I don't know. I think, the NCHC had dominated for so many years on the national scale, both in what they did in non-conference play during the regular season and winning a national championship. Everything in college sports is cyclical, in sports in general, I should say. The Big Ten's having a good year. Can Hockey East push back up to the top, of the country? I think that's one of the big storylines. I think we're still waiting to see how some of the rosters play out with the way that freshmen impacted college hockey this year. Can Macklin Celebrini win the Hobie as a 17-year-old? He will still be 17 when next season ends. I think that could be a big storyline to watch because he is talented enough to where I think we put him in the conversation before the season starts. Does the NCHC make a big This is the first year since the realignment NCHC hasn't had a Frozen Four team. Do they make a big comeback and push back here after a year that's down by its standards? So, and then of course you mentioned it. Is there a new king atop the CCHA? What happens in Atlantic hockey where American International had become the king and RIT knocked them off? Are we going to see some more teams, get in on the fun in Atlantic hockey here? So it seems like a lot's up for grabs next year.
We've got coming into next season. I think one of the big questions I have is, will the Big Ten be even better next season? I think that's going to be one of with Mike Hastings in there, with the job that Adam Nightingale has done with Michigan State. I think there's a lot of opportunity there for the Big Ten to be even better this year after the incredible year that they had. Now, Minnesota and Michigan, they will have very different looking rosters next year. That might challenge things a little bit, but I just think the depth of that conference will continue. Just like you said, seeing what Macklin Celebrini brings to the table. We're so excited to see Adam Fantilli this year. Can Celebrini be the same thing? So I'm really excited to see what those two guys can potentially do and bring to the table. But I think it's going to be fascinating to watch next season. There's so much we don't know about this season that will play out here in these last couple of days. And then also in the offseason as players move around and shift and everything else. But before I let you go, I want to get your take. Who wins the Hobie Baker, and also who you got for the Frozen Four?
I think Adam Fantilli wins the Hobie Baker. He has a substantial point lead right now. It's really not that close. So the only other thing that you could look at is goals, and he's one away from the national lead in that too. So when you have that many points and you're at the top in goals, I think he's just a really heavy favorite to win. He has 21 more points than any of his line mates. It's been a ridiculous year for him. I'm gonna in the season the way I started it, and that's by predicting Quinnipiac to win the national championship. No reason to change my pick now. I'm sticking with it.
All right. Well, he's going wire to wire with QU. Before you go, I'll give mine as well. Fantilli for the Hobie. I mean, it's unless things got a little crazy in the committee meeting, and it may have. it's him. and then for me, I'm going to go Minnesota over Quinnipiac in a thrilling championship game. I had Minnesota at the beginning of the season, so I'll go wire to wire with the Gophers. So, Brad, I can't thank you enough. Every time you come on, I feel like I learned something. I know the listeners do as well. Hope you enjoy the Frozen Four. We won't enjoy the sun with it, but we will enjoy the hockey. So, Brad, thanks again for always stopping in and helping us out here on Talking Hockey Sense.
Anytime. Thanks, Chris.
All right. That's Brad Schlossman of the Grand Forks Herald. You can follow him at SchlossmanGF on Twitter and read his work at the Grand Forks Herald. He also has his transfer portal, which updates daily and is free to read. So definitely check that out. A great resource for college hockey and certainly for myself because I check it pretty much every day. All right. I'm going to turn the rest of this show over to you. We're going to get through as many questions as we can with the time that we have left. And really excited to get to these questions. They're a variety. It's not just college hockey. We've got a lot of prospect questions. We got all kinds of stuff. And we're going to start us off with a question that I got last week, but I ran out of time for. And this one comes to us from Michael. And Michael asks, which players would you consider the next wave of premium offensive talent? Pick 5 names from NHL players of 100 games, prospects, draft eligibles. Who would you say has the highest offensive ceiling? Essentially, who are the future 100-point players? Thanks. Well, Michael, I mean, it's always tough to predict, but I think in terms of offensive ceiling, it's hard to go anywhere other than Connor Bedard as having the highest offensive ceiling among players coming into the NHL. I think that he is going to be a 100-point scorer. I think he's going to be a 50 to 60 goal scorer at some point in his career over many different years. As I've watched the CHL playoffs, and that's where I've seen just he continues to elevate. I don't know if you've had a chance to watch any of his games for the WHL playoffs playing against Saskatoon, and Regina not favored in that series. He's been incredible. I mean, just he's got guys draped on him. He's still scoring goals. Um, to me, that's the guy. I mean, I think he's the highest potential player up there. Another guy, you're going to see him at the Frozen Four, Logan Cooley. I had him number 1 on my draft board last year. I still feel validated in that. I mean, obviously, there's a long way to go, but I feel validated that he will be the best offensive performer from that draft class. I think the skill level is immense. The speed is immense. He is going to be the modern NHL player. I think that he has a lot of those characteristics that some of the top American players of recent times have. And so, I just think that there is so much fire in him to be great. And that's why I think that he is going to be a substantial contributor at the NHL level going forward. Another guy, I think Matty Beniers is going to be a continued threat. He's going to be a top line forward for years to come with Seattle. I do think that he'll retain that mantle even when Shane Wright has reached his maturation as a player. I just think Matty Beniers has a few more tools. He's a very good defensive player as well, so maybe the offensive numbers don't come, but I still think that that's a guy that has a ton of upside to be a big scorer at the NHL level. I don't know if he'll ever hit 100 points, but he's certainly one of those guys that I think has the potential to do that. After that, I think Matvei Michkov, if he does come to the U.S. and if you have not heard, a very strange story out of Russia. Matvei Michkov, of course, the top prospect out of Russia for the 2023 NHL Draft. Tragically, his father died under mysterious circumstances. His body was discovered in a pond near their home in Sochi, and that is under investigation. There's a lot of concern about what that actually means. There's so much speculation out there. But I mean, just to think this is a young man that's lost his father at a young age and an important year in his life, and certainly months before, a potentially life-changing moment of the NHL draft. And so our concern goes out to Matvei Michkov, but in pure hockey terms, he's one of the smartest hockey players I've ever watched. He's an offensive dynamo and a genius, I think. And I think, I know you asked for 5, but there's 4 right there that I think are going to be top end premium style players. And we've even got more coming in the next couple of years. And Max Celebrini, Michael Misa, James Hagans, those are the types of guys that we'll be talking about going forward as some great potential guys. All right. Our next one comes from @Agent Smith 212. And this also was from last week, but I wasn't able to get there. And who should the New York Rangers target with their 2023 first, assuming it's between 20 and 25? We know there's been a lot of movement among the draft prospects in this year, and I think that when you're a team like New York, you're going to have some good players to choose from in that range. We fully expect them to have a strong season and maybe even go on a deep playoff run here. But to come up with a good draft pick, I mean, it's tough to say. I think that 20 to 25 range, based on players that I think will be available there, like one guy that I think is kind of hovering around that range that is most intriguing to me is Gabe Perreault, who's had a tremendously productive season at the National Team Development Program with the U.S. Under-18 team. I think he's going to be phenomenal there. And, that's a guy that I really have a lot of time for in that range. And I think that the Rangers, they brought in Patrick Kane, they have Artemi Panarin. I think that with the players they have, they could use even more of a dynamic element up front. Capo Caco and Alexis Lafreniere are skilled, but are they dynamically skilled? They can score and different, but I think you might want to find more players like that. Perreault doesn't necessarily fit their profile. The Rangers often are looking at guys that have a little more size, that have, that kind of thing. But that's a player that I think in that range would be very acceptable there. So very, very good players. And I think that, the Rangers are going to be able to land an impact prospect in that range. Our next question actually comes via direct message, so you won't see this one pop up on the screen if you're watching, but I did want to get this one from Tommy, and he asked, does Logan Cooley sign with Arizona after the Frozen Four? If he does, will Cole Yzerman accelerate to go to Minnesota next season? Great question there from Tommy. I just wanted to quickly go over that one. And we talked a little bit about it last week, Tommy. So I don't want to rehash it. I think that Cooley, there's a chance that he goes back to Minnesota next year. We believe Jimmy Snuggerud will be going back. It all comes down to whether the Arizona Coyotes think that they should do that or not. Like basically, should we go for, are we ready to have Logan Cooley? Can we support him? Can we give him the NHL minutes that he's going to need to develop? Those are all the questions they have to ask. And it's also what Cooley has to ask, what he wants. I think there's a chance he could sign. He had a tremendous season, very dominant. We just haven't seen as many one and dones lately, but he certainly is a strong candidate to be one of them. And on the other side of that, I haven't gotten any information that suggests that Cole Yzerman has taken the steps necessary to accelerate to go play Minnesota next year. As good as he is, and he set the U17 goal scoring record at the National Team Development Program this year, as good as he is, I think there's a lot more of his game that he needs to continue to work on. I think his skating needs to improve. He needs to get stronger. He could go into college next year and certainly be a competitive player. I think he could be, he's an elite goal scorer, tremendous goal scoring sense, great shot. But I think that there are some steps that he could take. Now, we have seen guys from the National Team Development Program accelerate plenty of times before. Noah Hannafin and Zach Werenski both accelerated at 17. And certainly Yzerman being on a similar track and probably feeling like he's at a similar level to Macklin Celebrini may want to go that route as well. Celebrini is accelerating to go to Boston University next year. Either way, I think that Cole Yzerman has a chance to have a historic career at the National Team Development Program, break all sorts of records. And whether he goes this year or next year, Minnesota is going to have an exceptional player. All right, our next one comes from Daniel, and this is another NHL draft related question. And this is about Nate Danielson. He says, do you see Nate Danielson's offensive game translating well to the NHL? And what do you see potentially his ceiling as at this point? So Nate Danielson from the Brandon Wheat Kings is a player on the rise in terms of his draft stock. He is I talk a lot with Corey Prom, and I know he's been very high on Danielson, had him really high in his rankings at the Athletic. I've certainly heard a lot of chatter from scouts about, this is a guy that they're keeping an eye on in terms of his value, has a lot of that. What I think Nate Danielson's true value is offensively is he plays a fairly simple game, and I mean that in a good way. Like he doesn't overextend himself for offense. He just he uses his body to his advantage. He's got a very strong hockey sense. He moves pucks well. He battles for pucks. Digs pucks out of trouble. So I think that does translate to the NHL because most times the highlight reel plays aren't there. You'd love to have guys that can dangle and do all the different things, but I think more times than not, it's a hardworking play that gets you a goal. And I think that's what Nate Danielson does, which is why he has a chance to go in the top 10 of this draft this year. To me, I think his ultimate ceiling is a number 2 center, a guy that, produces in more of a secondary way and, can play in the matchups. So I think he's probably a middle 6 center with a chance to top out as a number 2. All right. Our next one comes from Luke. And this is another draft related question. Luke asks, for teams that end up picking 5 to 8 at the draft this summer, what are your thoughts on the quality of player available compared to other draft classes? And also, have you watched this season? Have any thoughts on Arizona second rounder Artem Duda? Just to get to the second question first, I haven't watched a ton of Duda this season. I liked him a lot in his draft year. I liked him the year before. I think that he's, certainly a talented, skilled player. Just haven't watched enough to give you a firm comment this season in terms of where he's at. I plan to catch up on some of that later on. But in terms of 5 to 8 of this particular draft class, I think that's the range where you still are going to mine above average players from previous draft years. I think that the top 8 and maybe even the top 10 or so, top 12 has a lot of higher end guys that I like. I think after that, it gets closer to more of an average draft in terms of what we've seen. Although I think there there are certainly some teams out there that believe some of the players that you're going to get in that later range still have tremendous value above previous draft years. But I think 5 to 8 is a great place to be. You think about guys like that should be available in that range, like Will Smith or Brian Leonard or maybe Zach Benson. There are players that are going to be there that could potentially be major impact prospects. So I think that if you're picking 5 to 8, you're still landing a guy that's going to be towards the top of your prospect pool, if not at the very top. Next one comes from Matt, and this one is a little funny. Devin Levi, is he this year's Vezina winner? Matt, I know that was tongue in cheek, but Devin Levi, 2 starts into his NHL career, certainly looks very, very good. On FloHockey.tv, I have a piece up that pretty much details why Devin Levi is one of the greatest college goalies of all time. You'll definitely have to check that out. He is an exceptional player. The numbers that he put up in college were incredible. He's not the typical size of a goaltender. He's about 6 foot 6'1". And a lot of teams want those guys 6'2". He came up from a junior A league, and really, there's a lot there that you kind of have to unpack. Are their biases against players, or the leagues that they play in? Because he went in the 7th round to Florida. But you look at what he's done in the NHL, and everything he was able to accomplish in college, he's been accomplishing at the NHL level. And I'll say this: the other thing about Devin Levi is he is just a tremendous competitor. He's dialed in mentally. He fights for every save. He is never out of it. He can make the big save, but he can also make the tough saves look easy. I think he has all of the tools to potentially be an award-winning goaltender at the NHL level. It's not a lock that he's going to be among the elite goalies at the NHL level, but what he's produced to this point as a goaltender certainly gives me reason to believe he's a long-term number 1, the goalie of the future for Buffalo, and maybe the long-term answer in net for that team. I really think that's special. And I look forward to seeing him progress in the NHL. All right. Next one comes from Tommy, and this is going to give me a chance to talk about the future of American hockey. And he says, not really a question, more just to point out that Will Moore is choosing USA instead of Canada. So Will Moore, a tremendous player from the 2007 birth year, and it hurts to say it out loud. These players all becoming prospects the year after I graduated college. Don't like that, but that's what we got to deal with. Will Moore, dual citizen, was named to the National Team Development Program's under 17 roster. He will be part of it. He is one of probably the top 4 forwards in a very crowded and loaded 2007 birth year at forward. The guys to know from that group: LJ Mooney, Cullen Potter, certainly Will Moore, among others. And I think it's going to be really exciting to see. He's a big kid. He's got a lot to offer. And we're going to hear a lot more about those guys coming down the road here. Excuse me. And since I'm coughing, that must mean there's only one question left, because I did the same exact thing last week. But here is our last question, and it comes from Chris Wassel, and he asks, I have to ask, who are your picks for the Frozen Four and Women's Worlds? Well, you may have heard today, earlier, I picked Quinnipiac and Minnesota to meet in the national championship game, with Minnesota winning that game. And at the Women's World Championship, which began the day that we're recording this, I will take Canada over USA. It pains me to do it as an American, but that is what I will do. They've won a lot of the big games lately. And also the U.S., very interestingly, a lot of new faces on that roster, a lot of turnover from the Olympic team in 2018. So you're not seeing some of those same players. That lack of experience is probably why I have a little bit more pause there. Before we get out of here, on the women's hockey note, want to remind you, on Hockey TV on Friday night, you'll be able to watch Annalise Bergman play for the Janesville Jets in the North American Hockey League. She will become the first woman ever to play junior hockey at the Tier 1 or Tier 2 level in the United States. Very excited about that game. Hockey TV, a partner of FloHockey, we will be covering that. Nicole Hazy, who's been a guest of this podcast and has been doing some freelance work for us at Flo, will be covering that game. So make sure you are following along with that. We will have plenty on our Flo platforms as well, including some other stories. But this is a historic moment in U.S. junior hockey. And Annalise Bergman is on the Olympic track for the women's side, but definitely has earned this opportunity to play in junior hockey in the United States. Now, she's heading to Cornell next year where she'll play women's hockey. So this is a one night only situation. You do not want to miss it. Annalise Bergman, a 6 foot, almost 6'1" goaltender, who played all season long with boys and has played her entire career with boys, and has played exceptionally well, is getting her one and only opportunity to play in junior hockey and will make history doing so. So make sure you check out Hockey TV on Friday at 7, or check out on FloHockey. We've got plenty more to talk about there, and we will be covering that story a lot. And you'll also be able to see some video from her first game on the Flow social platforms. One last cough for the road. So I want to give a special thanks to Brad Schlossman for joining the podcast today, and I'm really excited to have him. He's such a good friend. Make sure you are reading his work because there's so much there to follow. So thanks to Brad for coming on. Huge thanks to Amanda for producing today, and also want to say thank you to everyone who asked questions and to you who listen, because without you, we wouldn't have a show. So thanks very much for that. Don't forget to leave a kind rating and review on the podcast on your app of choice. Check us out on YouTube and FloHockey. And definitely come back next week. We'll recap the Frozen Four, and we'll get back to a lot more 2023 NHL Draft talk on Talking Hockey Sense. My name is Chris Peters. So glad you could join us. We'll catch you next time.